5 minutes. Time was almost up. Propping her body carefully against the wall of the workshop, he sat down beside her, utterly defeated. Across from the room, glowing softly on the desk, he could see the last few minutes of sand slowly slipping through the hourglass. With a heavy sigh, he closed his eyes and rested his throbbing head against the wall. His horn was still sparkling and smoking slightly, his magic reserves empty. He had nothing more to give. He had nothing more he could do. He had failed. Slowly, he lifted his foreleg and stared at the burnt fur on it, a souvenir from his expedition into town. The burn wasn't bad. He certainly felt no pain, but the gray fur on his leg had become blackened and charred, with several places burned off completely to reveal tender flesh beneath. There was a similar burn on his flank that he noticed, now that he had a moment to rest. He was tired, his limbs ached, and his wing hung uselessly at his side. All of these injuries he had received over the course of the day, trying to complete the project he couldn't even finish now. He cast a sideways glance at his companion. She just sat there, head slumped forward with her back against the wall. He was dimly aware of her shoulder pressing lightly against his, the feeling of her fur on his calming him down somewhat. After staring at her for a few seconds, a weak smile touched his lips. In the end, all the trouble he had gone through was worth it, if only to have someone else here with him as time slowly ran out. Sighing again, he leaned over and rested his head on her shoulders. He closed his eyes, enjoying the feeling of not being alone anymore, even if it was just an illusion. He remained that way for a few moments, before cracking an eye open and glancing at the hourglass. Just a few minutes remained before it was over. Snorting, he pushed himself up off the wall and stood up, grunting softly as he struggled to get to his bad leg beneath him. He ruffled one of his good wings, working the kinks out of it, before stretching. His back cracked several times, and he groaned in discomfort. Several feathers fell from his wing and fluttered to the floor. He turned and, placing a hoof beneath her chin, tilted the mare's head slightly. Her mane fell away from her face, a few loose strands remaining to cover her forehead. He gazed down at her, taking every detail in that he could in the dim light of the room. He may have made her, but he wanted one last look at her. Her lavender coat, her horn, her velvet mane. He looked at everything, trying to cement it into memory. With that complete, he leaned forward and bumped muzzles with her. Her nose was cold, and it caused a small shiver to run down his back. He didn't pull away, though. Doggedly, he remained for what was several seconds, his nose pressed against hers, nostril flaring as he breathed softly. The connection was broken as he leaned his head back. The mare remained motionless. The sand continued to flow. With a dejected sigh, he took several steps backwards and was about to turn around when a faint movement caught his attention. Ears pricking slightly, he glanced back at the mare and cocked his head to the side. She remained as still as before, but he waited with bated breath, watching for every sign of life. Several more seconds passed, where nothing happened, before his eyes widened in surprise at the mare's right ear flapped weakly against her head. There was a brief pause before it flickered again, followed by a twitch of the tail. The ear twitched for the third time before her chest suddenly rose and she took a deep breath. Her head jerked to the side as she took another breath. Then, with a small gasp, her eyes fluttered open. He could only stand there, a look of joy slowly spreading across his face as she blinked twice, and then glanced around the room before her eyes came to rest on him. They were violet in color, one of them slightly bigger than the other. She squinted, her pupils dilated and expanding, before she gasped again and quickly got to her hooves. Well, it was more of a drunken stagger, her legs trembling beneath her, giving her the appearance of a newborn foal. When she finally got to her legs, she glanced ever at him, eyes filled with wonder and curiosity. He could only smile, a feeling of relief and unbridled joy welling up in his chest. He stared blankly for a few seconds before she timidly returned the smile, her lips twitching faintly. He stepped forward slowly, his good wing flaring slightly, allowing her to take it in his scent. She shielded back as he approached, causing him to pause. Watching him closely, she swallowed before taking a tentative step forward and meeting him halfway. With a soft nicker, the pair bumped snouts, nostrils flaring as they took in each other's scents. After a few moments, he pulled his nose back, earning him a confused look from the mare. She cocked her head to the side, blinking up at him. Still smiling, he turned and limped over to the desk. He cast a quick glance at the hourglass, the last grains of sand slowly slipping through the neck, before turning his attention to look at the book currently placed open on the desk. Closing it with a soft thump, he picked it up in his mouth and carried it over to the mare. She gave a look of curious glance as he approached, her horn lighting up when he offered it to her. A rosy red aura surrounded the book, levitating it over to the mare. She looked down at the worn-out cover before glancing back up at him, her timid smile still on her face. He returned the smile, and then leaned forward to gently give her a gentle nuzzle. On the other side of the room, the hourglass ran out. The mare's timid smile quickly turned into confusion, and then to alarm as he began to dissolve, his body turning to dust. A sudden breeze began to blow about the room, tossing the dust into the air. He had time to give her one last, weak smile before his entire body was consumed, reduced into a cloud of glowing particles. It swirled around the room, slowly picking up speed until it was a veritable whirlwind of glowing dust. The mare cried out in alarm as all the objects in the room began to move at once. Gems rolled across the floor, gathering themselves together as the broken jars netted themselves. The strips of fabric began to roll themselves back up, the cut pieces fusing back together to the main roll, before flying back to their allotted spots on the dark desk shelves. Bones flew into their corresponding boxes, feathers floated around the room, and teeth clattered together as they sorted themselves back into their containers. Threads spooled themselves, the needles sliding back into the nearby pincushion. A large chunk of clay morphed and diluted through the air before forming itself back into a square. All the items swirled about the room like debris in a twister before flying back into their original places around the room. Gems, teeth, thread, and clay, all going back to the shelves. Boxes of bones and feathers sliding back into the closet. As soon as it had started, the whirlwind halted, and silence fell over the room. Dust particles floated in the air, gradually resettling after all the chaos that had just taken place. The mare stood there, wide-eyed, and mouth agape. Slowly, she glanced around and reorganized the room. Her eyes drifted to the floor, and she eyed the hoof prints in the dust, the only indication that the stallion had ever been there. Shallowly thickening, she glanced down at the old tome that was still held in her magic. With a click, the hourglass slowly turned over, and the sand began to flow again.